Welcome. Here we discuss neuro-based psychology, cross-species consciousness, and more. Be inspired.
Tastes, odors, colors, and so on reside only in consciousness. If the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. Galileo. 16th century wisdom. What is very interesting is that since then, people have wiped away a very important part of what he says. Speaking of wiping away things, he said, if any living creature. So he's referring to living beings. What we look at, if we're looking at the phrase, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? That famous philosophical question. So since Galileo, from what one will generally find, and let me know if you find someone who discusses it otherwise, but the philosophical question is often answered when it's referring to sound as experience processed by the sensory system in the brain. So we can define sound in two ways. Of course, if it's vibration in the air, yes, it exists. But if it refers to consciousness, and no one was around to hear it, then it is said to not exist. What often when people refer to this, they're referring to if a human doesn't hear it. So, we're referring to ourselves so often. We've gone backwards in a sense. We're like little babies. Little babies feel, the entire world. That's their whole world. They're not as aware. They're not. In fact, until we're 4, we're not aware that other beings even have their own minds, separate from ours. But we've actually gone backwards, and I think there's a motivation behind it. If we want to mistreat animals, it's the motivation behind speciesism. The idea of speciesism, separating ourselves from other species, and what we do is make ourselves higher. So, but in a normal forest, in any woods, there's many creatures. And I'm fascinated by the minds of insects in particular. Well, all of the living creatures are just so precious, and we must treat them with kindness. But insects also, we're discovering, are quite conscious. And I discuss this in other videos. So, in the world we live in, there's always going to be sound if a tree falls and no one's around. Well, we have to take into account the insects, all of the creatures. But the other point that's being made with this philosophical question is about consciousness itself. It's about experience. If no one is experiencing it, does it exist? Is it part of reality? But how do we judge who's experiencing it? We've misjudged non-human animals for far too long. Gives us an excuse to mistreat them. So let us reflect on this quote. If a tree falls, or it's a philosophical question, so it's worded slightly different depending on where you look. But if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, again, the question whether we're talking about sound as vibration or conscious experience. So whenever we talk about consciousness and the experience we have in our mind, with color, with all of the sensory, although in the brain sound is processed very specifically, whereas color isn't, that's a whole other discussion. But the question is, our consciousness, our perception, our experience of something is what is important If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? This philosophical question has been asked for centuries. It's misanswered if all living beings aren't included.